I would like to welcome on stage Bill Emmott, author, chairman of IISS, and what most of us journalists know him as, the former editor of The Economist, and Kishore Mahbubani, professor in practice of public policy at the National University of Singapore. Please join me. Welcome.
Thank you.
Kishore, I'm going to start with you because you have written a book entitled Has the West Lost It? Tell us. We don't have time to read the book. Has the West lost it?
Well, if you have time, read the book. It's a 1-hour read. I'll give you the 1-minute answer. The answer is no, or more accurately, not yet. Because unless the West adjusts to a fundamental strategic shift in history, which is that the past 200 years of Western domination of world history have been a major historical aberration, because from the year 1 to the year 1820, for 1800 of the last 2,000 years, the two largest economies were always those of China and India. And now we're seeing the natural return of China and India and the rest of Asia. Just yesterday's Financial Times had a great article about how the Asian century has begun, but it has begun without the West adjusting to it. And if the West doesn't adjust to it, it will continue to make serious strategic mistakes, and then it will lose it.
So adjusting to this Asian century, Bill, why hasn't the West caught up with it, even though we've been reading about the inevitability of the Asian century?
Well, my first response to, and I'm a British person, a European rather than an American, of course, that's a very crucial distinction, but I'm a Westerner. My first response to Kishore's provocation is, did the West ever have it? How could we lose it if we didn't have it? And in the historic sense, of course, we did have it, but I think that the West since 1945 has constantly been competing with itself in a kind of almost like a bipolar disorder way between nationalism and internationalism. The West, for hundreds of years, fought itself. Basically, conflicts were principally between countries of the West. After 1945, having had the worst of all conflicts, we decided, with American leadership, we were present at the creation, as John Foster Dulles put it, and we built international institutions, but the Americans never really believed in them. Now, what we've had since 2008, and the worst financial crisis in 80 years, has been a new feeling of stress and strain within Europe and America that has renewed, I think, that bipolar thing between nationalism and internationalism. What the West has lost is its own belief in international cooperation. My country is leaving the European Union, the greatest creation of international cooperation in history, or might be leaving it, or doesn't know what it's doing, in fact. And Donald Trump is combating internationalism. A whole load of elections are essentially going to be about nationalism in Europe versus internationalism. So what we've lost is that cooperation. I don't believe that we failed to recognize the Asian century. We've been writing about it for 50 years. Japan, China, India, it's basically the reality of the world. But what we failed to do is reconcile ourselves to our own demons between nationalism and internationalism.
I want to pick up on your point about the European-American transatlantic partnership that was seen as such a pillar of the second half of the 20th century. And of course, part of that was NATO.
Yep.
This strategic alliance. Today we raise questions, is NATO going to survive? We've seen questions about Turkey, Trump's attitude towards NATO. Do you think NATO will survive? Is that still a strategic alliance that can survive all this turmoil?
First of all, there were two constants in terms of cover stories in The Economist during my 13 years as editor, 93 to 2006. One was crisis in transatlantic relations, constantly. Secondly was, is NATO obsolete? Question mark. And the answer to the first was always, yes, there's a crisis, but it can be solved. Secondly, the answer is, well, if you didn't have NATO, you'd try to reinvent it in some way. So NATO's in difficulty, clearly. I think Turkey is the biggest challenge to NATO, frankly. I don't think Donald Trump is a big challenge to NATO. I think that NATO will continue to survive, but the question is, what's it for? What is NATO about? That's really the existential issue about NATO. NATO is about European security. But then what does that mean? Who contributes to it? The Europeans pay a lot more than the Americans for European security, despite what Donald Trump says, but are they able to act? Those are the questions that face NATO.
One of the issues I'm pulling up from that is as we see in Asian century, as we see a re-emergence of Asia, there are questions about security. You know, we don't have a NATO-esque type of military alliance, but there is thoughts about Russia's military presence, China, and the South China Sea. What are your thoughts in terms of the security and the military aspects of this change that we're seeing?
Well, I think the danger of looking at the world through Western lenses is that because the West has become so pessimistic about the future, it only sees darkness everywhere and doesn't see the light in the world. And you know, the most important fact of our time is that in the last 30 years, we have made more progress in human history than we ever have since human history began, right? War and peace. The chances of dying in interstate wars almost zero nowadays. Global poverty from 75% of the world's population in 1950 to less than 10% today. Global middle class population from 1.8 billion to 3.2 billion to 4.9 billion in 20 years. It's an amazingly wonderful world, which is why the West's emphasis on security is all wrong. Because at the end of the day, what does Asia want to do with the West? It doesn't want to attack the West. It doesn't want to conquer the West. It wants to work with the West. All it's asking the West to do is adjust to the fact that you can no longer control and dominate the world in the way that you used to. Stop saying that the head of the IMF must always be a European, the head of the World Bank must always be an American. Stop that. And understand that in the world of tomorrow, the challenges are different. And let me give you one concrete example on security, okay? If you are a European and you ask yourself a very simple question, where is the next big threat going to come from? Are there going to be Russian tanks coming towards Europe? Zero possibility. Where's the real threat? I'll give you the real threat. In the year 1950, Europe's population was twice that of Africa's. Today, Africa's population is twice that of Europe, more than twice. By 2100, it will be 10 times the size of Europe. It's the migrant boats that are coming that's going to distort the European political processes and all that. And what's the answer to that? And let me tell you what the answer to that. The answer to that is African economic development. And who's your number one partner for African economic development? Is China. So if Europe wants to look at its own future security and protect itself in the long run, it should not see China as a threat. It should see China as an opportunity. But the problem here is, and I guarantee you this, and that's what my next book is about, the United States will see China as a threat in the next 10 years. So if you're looking for security, whose security are you looking for, American or European? And the answers are different.
So as the answers are different for European or American security, let's talk about American security for a moment. Knowing that Bill is not American, but we can all speak about America without Americans on the stage. It happens to the Arabs all the time. So the United States is in a position that most of us find difficult to understand. There is, of course, internal turmoil. But really what is something to behold is America's attitude when it comes to protectionism and the trade wars that we're seeing with China. Is it inevitable that China and America have to go head-to-head when it comes to trade and when it comes to economic influence, if we're not talking about trying to push military dominance, but economic dominance?
You're asking?
Yes.
Well, I mean, we are actually, I must say, at a very plastic moment of human history, okay? because it's clear that as of now, United States is still bigger than China. But the relativity has changed dramatically. In 1980, China's GNP terms was 10% of United States. Now it's bigger. In the year 2000, in nominal market terms, United States GNP was 8 times the size of China, 2000. Now it's 1.5 times. The relativity is changing very fast and will continue to change. Now, when relativity changes, the logical thing to do is to adjust. And I can tell you that given the mood in the United States today, especially when you have a leader like President Donald Trump who says, America first, the rest of the world, wherever you are, we don't care. Now, with that kind of attitude, you cannot get the kind of adjustments that are needed. And at the end of the day, China is prepared to adjust and continue to accept American leadership of the global order, because China's priority at the end of the day is taking care of 1.4 billion people at home. Believe me, it's a miracle every day China stays together. It's a miracle every day China continues to grow. They have a domestic focus. But if you push them, if you continue to send naval vessels close to Chinese installations in the South China Sea, China will react, and then you create all kinds of escalation. But we can actually, today, prevent a worst-case outcome in a US-China relationship if both sides make careful adjustments to each other. But to make that kind of adjustments, America will have to accept the possibility that within 10 to 15 years, it may become number 2. But no American politician can speak about America becoming number 2 because it's politically suicidal in America. You're dead. So if you cannot speak about the inevitable reality, you cannot prepare for it, and then a tragedy will unfold.
Well, let's go to Winston Churchill. America always can be relied upon to do the right thing, he said, once it has exhausted the alternatives. And I think that what we see is this exploration of the alternatives, and that's been a constant American thing. But Americans understand reality. They can see it. They don't want to speak about it, as Kishore absolutely rightly says. But they can see it. And I actually think that what's going on with North Korea now is, in a way, an exploration of reality by the United States. You know, Donald Trump comes into office, he blusters, he talks about the failures of all his predecessors, he says he's going to rain down fire and fury on North Korea, and then what happens? Suddenly they're writing love letters to each other. And he's holding these summits and so on. And I think what he's seeing is that actually conflict and intervention isn't going to deal with this. Basically, it's a containment, engagement issue in which China plays a very vital role. So I think what we're seeing evolving, I hope, out of the North Korean situation is some sort of American acceptance that the idea that cruise missiles could solve this have gone. In trade, I absolutely agree with Kishore that you need to accept the reality. There will be constant friction. I sort of grew up in my writing career on US-Japan friction, and that was the similar relationship, except they weren't strategic security rivals anymore. But had Japan not had its crash in 1990, we would still be looking at friction between Japan and the US. It's going to go on throughout our lives, but the point is about avoiding conflict. Now, I'm glad to say, as a small advert for the International Institute for Strategic Studies, that the major security conference and venue for discussing these issues was established as a collaboration between the IISS and the government of Singapore.
We get along very well.
Well, I'm going to have to find a way to bring some friction to the stage at this point. But I want to pick up on the
Just
trade
let me
point.
know. I'm happy to say anything provocative if you want.
I know we can always count on Singapore. We can always count on Singapore. Now, I want to follow up on the trade point, because I think many of us are confused about what is going to happen with the World Trade Organization. We see the tariffs that America has imposed on Chinese goods, and the Chinese retaliated. Granted, no new tariffs were added, but we're still not where we thought we'd be at the beginning of this year. So how do we deal with that conundrum?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. I mean, I think that the World Trade Organization is a prime example of the challenges of multilateral organizations. You set them up, you need constantly to reform them because the world changes. Innovation happens, new countries get new interests, new interests develop. You need to have a process of evolution. The crucial situation we're in now is a lack of leadership towards the renovation of the institutions like the WTO. I don't believe the United States actually are going to try to destroy the WTO. I think there's too many powerful interests and understandings of why the WTO needs to be kept. But for the moment, in this administration, I don't think there's a mission to lead a reformation of the WTO. So I think in 2020 or 2024, whenever the Trump era ends, we will still have the WTO, but we'll still be worrying about how to make it fit for this 21st century era, particularly technology, intellectual property, and all the issues related to it. We'll hang on, but not in a very constructive way.
You wanted a disagreement, right?
Yes, go ahead.
Last year I was on a sabbatical. I spent time in 6 different universities, including 3 in the United States, to do research on where the United States is heading in its policy towards China. And number 1, the concern about China is rising. Number 2, the United States is deeply divided. It's not just Trump, by the way. The establishment itself is very deeply divided. And the most dangerous aspect of this divisions that is happening in America is that many Americans actually believe, and you said this, that the 1945 institutions, which were a gift from the West to the rest of the world, are now constraints on the United States, including the WTO. So there are people, and I would say very powerful and influential people in the United States government who are going all out to undermine key multilateral institutions, and maybe in the hope of them dying. And I can tell you, WTO is clearly in the line of fire, and you can paralyze the WTO, which is what the United States is doing by refusing to appoint judges to the panel, arbitration panels, and then it cannot operate anymore, right? And the tragedy here is that, the key argument I make in this book is that if the West wants to create a new world order that will be beneficial for 12% of the world's population that lives in the West, the best thing to do is to strengthen the 1945 institutions, the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO. But precisely at the time when you need to strengthen this institution, the United States is clearly crippling the WTO. It is appointing someone who hates the World Bank to become the head of the World Bank, right? And if you look at the United Nations and you look at the statements that they're making, if you look just for example, this just happened yesterday, right? President Trump signs an order saying that he recognizes that Golan Heights is no longer Syrian territory. This violates every Security Council resolution, right? Now, if that's not a defiance of multilateral organizations, what is? Right? So this is very, very dangerous. And so we should acknowledge that this is very dangerous. And my biggest disappointment in Europe is that the one continent that could stand up to America and say, hey, we need these multilateral institutions is Europe. But where are the European voices? Why aren't they speaking out? Why aren't the European leaders saying? Maybe they should come out all unanimously and say, hey, the declaration that the Golan Heights is not part of Syria violates every Security Council resolution. But there's no such announcement. So this is the time for Europe to stand up, and if it does so, then I'll have more hope for the world.
But isn't it really time for Asia to stand up if we see that Europe is leaving that vacuum? Isn't it the time then for Asian leaders to come and say, we will take the mantle?
That would be wonderful. the logical candidate will be China. But the minute China tries to grab any kind of leadership, the United States opposes. And I'll give you a simple, concrete example. And this is from Barack Obama's time. Barack Obama is the opposite of Donald Trump. He's an open, tolerant person and a wonderful human being. In his administration, when China proposed to set up an Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, right? And Asia needs infrastructure, trillions of dollars in infrastructure. China proposed, America, Barack Obama opposed. And so allies like Japan, Australia, South Korea were told, don't sign. It's an anti-American act. So that's what happens.
But Britain did sign.
Ah.
Britain led the rebellion against...
That's true.
...against Obama's blocking.
And you know how they reacted?
So let's remember the history of this.
Yeah.
In the 1990s, there was an effort to set up a thing called the Asian Monetary Fund during the East Asian financial crisis and so on.
That's right.
Bill Clinton successfully blocked it. The AIIB comes along. Obama tries to stop people signing up to it. Basically, it's still there. It's a fact on the ground. And we've had Xi Jinping in Europe these last few days, notably in Italy, getting endorsements of the Belt and Road Initiative, and in France with Merkel and Macron. The world has changed. And frankly, Europeans have to accept it, but so do Asians. We're in a different world. Now, it's going to be a scratchy world. I'm also worried about some of these trends that Kishore's worried about, but ultimately I'm an optimist about it because I think that there's a kind of acceptance of reality that comes along and has to bow down to it. And I don't think that we're going to see a confrontation with reality, even from the United States. Europe is constantly punching below what its weight should be in the world. There's no doubt about that. Angela Merkel is in her last time period as Chancellor. Emmanuel Macron is fighting off people in the streets wearing yellow vests and in some difficulty. Britain, my God, what the hell are we doing? I have no idea. But Britain, in a way, gives the reality to the American debate because you can confront the WTO, you can reject multilateralism, but then the question is, well, what's your alternative plan? What Britain is facing up to is the fact that we didn't have an alternative plan to being a member of the European Union. And Parliament and all the Brexiters don't have an alternative plan. The same will happen in America. I hope in a better way than in Britain.